Billionaire last dying wished to see the Black Maid. What happened changed everything. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady hum of machines and the faint beeping of the heart monitor. Curtains were pulled half closed, letting in only a sliver of afternoon light. For a man who had built empires out of steel and glass, this was now his kingdom. 4 white walls, a hospital bed, and the slow passing of time. He had once been a name that commanded respect everywhere. Business leaders sought his approval, politicians called him for advice, and even his rivals could not deny his influence. But now, lying frail and sunken into the stiff white sheets, he was not the billionaire, not the tycoon, not the empire builder. He was simply a man at the end of his life. Around him stood his family. His sons and daughters were dressed in sharp suits and elegant dresses, clothes that spoke of money and power, even here in this place where money had little meaning. Their expressions were stiff. Some were restless, checking their watches, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Others stared silently at him, as if waiting for the moment when the last breath would escape his lungs and the next chapter of their lives, inheritance, control, legacy, would begin. The doctors had already told them there was little time left. His heart was failing. His body, after years of fighting, was finally surrendering. All that remained was to say his last words, to give instructions, to pass on wisdom or wealth. That was what everyone expected, but the billionaire had other thoughts. He looked at his children one by one, his cloudy eyes scanning their polished faces. He saw ambition, impatience, even hunger. For years he had taught them to be strong, to never show weakness, to chase success no matter the cost, and they had learned well. But now, as the weight of his life pressed heavily on him, he wondered if he had taught them the wrong things. His voice was weak, a scratch of sound that made even the closest relative lean forward to catch it. "I have one last wish." Immediately, his eldest son straightened, ready to hear instructions about the company. A daughter stepped closer, expecting perhaps a final blessing for the family fortune. But the words that came out of his mouth stunned them all. "I want to see her." "See who, father?" asked his son, frowning. The old man's eyes flickered with a spark of life as he whispered, "The maid. Bring me the maid." The room fell into silence, broken only by the mechanical beep of the monitor. His children looked at each other, confused. Some let out small, nervous laughs as if he had made a mistake in his weakness. "Father, perhaps you are not feeling well," one of them said gently. "You mean a nurse, maybe? Someone here?" He shook his head slowly, each movement costing him strength. "No, not a nurse. I want her. The maid, the one who worked in our house long ago. Bring her to me." The family was stunned. Why would a billionaire, in his final hours, ask to see a servant from years ago? Why not ask to see old business partners or trusted friends or even a priest? Why her? One of the daughters crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "Father, this is absurd. Why would you ask for a maid? We should be focusing on family matters, on your will, on what happens next. Why waste time?" The old man's eyes sharpened despite his weakness. "Because it matters," he whispered. "More than anything else." The children exchanged glances. Some were angry, others confused, but none of them could understand. As they whispered among themselves, the billionaire lay back, exhausted. His mind wandered to memories from long ago, memories his children had never seen. He thought of the early days when he was not yet powerful, when he had more enemies than friends, when his temper was short and his soul was darker. And he thought of her, the maid with gentle eyes and quiet dignity, who had once spoken words that saved him from himself. He closed his eyes, waiting. He did not know if his family would obey his request. He only knew that before he left this world, he needed to see her one last time. The family eventually stepped out of the room to discuss in hushed tones. Some wanted to ignore the request, believing it was just the fading mind of a dying man. Others argued that fulfilling it would give him peace. After all, he had spent his whole life giving orders, and his word had always been law. Who were they to deny him now? Reluctantly, they agreed to send someone to find her. But in their hearts, questions burned. Why her? What role could a simple maid have played in the life of a man who had conquered industries and ruled boardrooms? Back inside the hospital room, the billionaire opened his eyes once more. His lips curved into the faintest smile, as if he could already sense that she was coming. The family did not understand. The world outside did not understand, but he knew, and soon they would all know. For what he was about to reveal would not just change how his family saw him. It would change how they saw life itself. The phone rang in a small, quiet house on the edge of town. The walls were painted in soft, faded colors. The furniture old but clean, the kind of home where every object carried years of memory. The woman who lived there was sitting by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair had turned silver, her back slightly bent, but her eyes still carried a certain calmness. She was not expecting any call that day, so when the phone rang, she rose slowly and answered with a gentle voice. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was formal, almost hesitant. It was a young assistant from the hospital, struggling to explain something she herself did not fully understand. "Ma'am, we were asked to reach you." "The billionaire?" "He asked for you." "By name." The woman froze, gripping the receiver a little tighter. "The billionaire?" she asked quietly, almost as if repeating the word to herself to be sure she had heard it right. "Yes," the assistant replied. "He is very weak, but he made a request. He wants to see you." For a long moment, the maid, once a servant in his vast mansion, now simply an elderly woman living on modest means, stood in silence. She had left that life many years ago, never expecting to be remembered. To hear that a man like him, surrounded by family, lawyers, and wealth, had asked for her specifically, it felt unreal. Her heart stirred with a mix of emotions. She remembered the long halls of the mansion, the way the family looked past her as though she were invisible. She remembered long nights of cleaning, of serving, of enduring silence. But she also remembered something else, quiet moments with him, the man who had employed her. Moments where his sharp exterior cracked and a flicker of vulnerability showed through. She had spoken to him like a human being when everyone else either feared him or sought to flatter him. Perhaps that was why he remembered. Still, she hesitated. Why would he want to see her now after all these years? What could he possibly want to say? Her life had moved on. She had children, grandchildren, a small community that respected her. The world of billionaires and power was no longer hers. The assistant's voice broke her thoughts. "Ma'am, would you come? It seems very important to him." Her fingers trembled slightly as she agreed. "Yes, I will come." She placed the receiver down and sat back into her chair. The weight of the past seemed to settle on her shoulders. She looked around her modest home, so different from the towering mansion where she had once worked. And yet in this little house she had lived a fuller life than in all the years she had served the wealthy. She wondered what awaited her now. When she told her daughter about the call, the younger woman frowned. "Mama, you don't need to go. After all these years, why should you? They never cared about you then, why now?" Her daughter's words were not untrue, but the maid shook her head gently. "Sometimes, child, a person's last words are not about the past. They are about peace. If he needs peace and I can give it, then I will go." Her daughter did not argue further, though worry stayed in her eyes. Together they prepared her simple black dress, the same one she wore to church on Sundays. She polished her shoes, brushed her hair, and carried herself with quiet dignity. She was not going as a servant. She was going as herself. The next morning she arrived at the hospital. The long corridors smelled of antiseptic, the walls lined with soft lights and signs pointing to different wards. As she walked, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Nurses and visitors glanced curiously at her, wondering who she was. After all, visitors to the billionaire were usually men in suits or women in diamonds, not an elderly maid in simple clothes. When she reached his floor, a group of family members stood outside his room. Their faces were sharp, polished, impatient. The moment they saw her, whispers began. Some frowned, others scoffed. A few stepped closer, their voices cutting. "Why are you here?" one of them demanded. "The hospital called me," she answered softly. "He must be confused," another muttered. "He doesn't know what he's saying. This is ridiculous." But before they could stop her, a nurse stepped out of the room and nodded firmly. "He asked for her. She comes in." The family fell silent, their expressions tight with disbelief. The maid walked past them, her steps slow but steady. She felt their eyes on her back, burning with judgment, but she did not falter. She had been unseen all her life by people like them. Their stares no longer held power over her. When she entered the room, her breath caught. There he was, the man she had once known as strong and commanding, now lying pale and fragile in a hospital bed. His hair was white, his skin thin, his eyes weary. Yet the moment he saw her, something changed. His lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time in years his eyes lit up. "You came," he whispered, his voice rough but full of relief. She stepped closer, her hands folded before her. "Yes, I came." He struggled to lift his hand, and she gently reached for it. The touch was simple, but the meaning was heavy. In that moment, the years between them seemed to fade. He was not the billionaire, and she was not the maid. He was a man facing the end, and she was the one person he wanted to see. Behind her, through the half-open door, the family watched in disbelief. They had never seen their father's face soften like this. They had never seen him reach for someone with such need, such gratitude. It was as if this woman, a maid from their past, held a key to a part of him they had never known. The maid sat quietly beside him, her hand still in his. She said nothing, waiting for him to speak. And though the family could not understand it, she did. She knew that sometimes the greatest conversations did not need words. Sometimes the presence of someone who once treated you with humanity was enough. In that quiet hospital room, a forgotten connection had been restored, and though the family could not see it yet, everything from this moment onward would change. The door closed softly behind her, shutting out the murmurs of the family still whispering in the hallway. The maid sat by the bed, her hand still in his, while the machines around them hummed and blinked. The air inside the room was heavy with the smell of medicine, but also with something else, expectation. The family had not left. They lingered outside, their shadows moving under the thin strip of glass in the door. They could not understand why he had called her here, and their pride would not let them walk away. The billionaire looked at her for a long time. His hand trembled in hers, the strength long gone from his fingers, but the way he held on showed determination. "I thought I would never see you again," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. She gave him a faint smile, the kind of smile that carried years of patience. "Life takes people different ways," she said gently. "But here we are." His eyes filled with a strange light. To his children, he had always been a man of control, someone who barked orders and demanded perfection. They had seen him raise his voice at employees, negotiate without mercy, and run his empire with steel in his words. Yet now, with this woman, he seemed almost soft. The door opened quietly, and his eldest son stepped inside. He stood stiffly in his dark suit, his jaw tight. "Father," he said firmly, ignoring the maid at first, "we need to speak with you about matters that cannot wait." The old man turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing with what little strength he had. "Not now." The son hesitated, then glanced at the maid. His voice lowered, but the bitterness showed. "Why is she here? Of all people, why call for her when your family's waiting?" The billionaire's voice was weak, but his words carried an edge that silenced the room. "Because she matters." The son's mouth opened to argue, but the old man's glare, though faint, was enough to hold him back. For years he had feared his father's authority. Even now, on his deathbed, the power of that gaze was not gone. The son clenched his jaw, gave a curt nod, and stepped back into the hall, his anger barely contained. The maid sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes calm. She did not respond to the insult, nor did she defend herself. She had faced worse in silence many times before. Her patience was not weakness. It was strength carved out of years of being overlooked, ignored, and underestimated. The old man coughed, struggling for breath. The nurse hurried over, adjusting the tubes and checking the monitors, but he waved her away with a trembling hand. He did not want machines or medicine to fill this last conversation. He wanted something real. "You know," he whispered to the maid, "they think I am a giant, a man who built towers and ruled boardrooms, but you are the only one who saw me when I was not a giant. When I was just a man." Her eyes softened. She remembered those days well. The long nights when he returned home furious from failed deals, when his anger spilled onto everyone around him. She had been just a maid, invisible in the shadows, yet there were times when she had spoken not to challenge him, but to remind him of his own humanity. A glass of water placed gently on his desk, a few words spoken softly when no one else dared, a reminder that kindness still existed even in a world built on power. "Do you remember?" he continued, his voice cracking. "The night I nearly threw everything away. I was so full of rage I could not see straight. You were there. You stopped me." She nodded slowly, her memory carrying her back to that night. He had been pacing in his office, furious after losing a massive contract. He had shouted at his family, thrown papers across the room, and threatened to destroy everything. No one dared go near him. No one but her. She had walked in quietly, placed a cup of tea on his desk, and said only one thing. "Sir, if you lose yourself, you lose everything else." It had been a simple sentence, spoken with respect, but also with truth. And in that moment, something inside him had shifted. He had not shown it then. He had only stared at her, dismissed her, and carried on. But her words had stayed. They had anchored him. Now, as he lay weak and fading, he remembered it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. "You gave me back my mind that night," he said. "Without you, I would have destroyed myself. I would not have built what I built." Her eyes grew wet, but she held them steady. She had never spoken of that night to anyone. To her, it was just one more moment of quiet service. But to him, it had been everything. Outside the door, the family listened in stunned silence. They had never heard their father speak like this. To them, he had always been proud, unshakable, unwilling to admit weakness. Yet here he was, confessing that a maid, someone they had barely noticed in their youth, had shaped the man he became. The billionaire squeezed her hand again, his eyes tired but filled with gratitude. "You reminded me that power means nothing without humanity, and I forgot that lesson for too long, but I never forgot you." The room was silent except for the steady beep of the monitor. The nurse stepped back, watching quietly. The family outside could hardly breathe, straining to catch every word. Finally, the maid spoke, her voice calm but full of weight. "You were a hard man, sir, but you were not blind. That is why you remembered. I only did what any human being should do, show kindness when someone needed it." His lips trembled into a faint smile. "Kindness," he repeated softly. "The one thing I could not buy, yet the one thing that saved me." The family outside exchanged glances. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. Doubt about their father, about themselves, about the legacy they thought they understood. If this maid had shaped the billionaire they admired, then what did that say about the values they had lived by? The tension in the hallway thickened, but inside the room there was peace. The old man had finally spoken words that had been locked inside him for decades, and the maid, who had carried her dignity quietly all her life, now sat as the witness to a truth no one could deny. The meeting was tense, yes, charged with disbelief, pride, and silence. But beneath it all, it was also the beginning of something deeper. A shift had started, one that would soon unravel everything the family thought they knew. And as the old man drifted into sleep, still holding her hand, the maid remained by his side. She did not need wealth nor recognition. The truth was enough, and that truth, once spoken, could never again be silenced. The night grew deeper in the hospital, and the hum of machines blended with the soft footsteps of nurses passing down the hallway. The billionaire lay in his bed, his hand still resting in the maid's. His breathing was shallow, but there was determination in the way he forced his tired eyes to stay open. His children, gathered outside the door, whispered impatiently, their voices sharp with confusion and disbelief. They could not understand why their father, a man of immense power and pride, would spend what little time he had left holding the hand of someone they had always considered invisible. The maid sat quietly, her posture upright but calm, her presence steady as if her life had prepared her for this very moment. She did not ask him why he called for her, nor did she question his reasons. She waited, knowing that when people reached the end of their road, they did not waste words on things that did not matter. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin and wavering, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime. "They think they know me," he whispered, his eyes flickering toward the door where the shadows of his children moved restlessly. "They believe I was always strong, always certain, always unshakable. But they do not know the man I was before the money, before the towers, before the world bowed its head to my name." The maid listened, her expression unchanged, though her heart felt the gravity of his confession. She had glimpsed pieces of that man years ago, but now he was ready to reveal the whole truth. "When I was young," he continued, his breath catching between sentences, "I was angry, angrier than anyone knew. The world was cruel, and I decided to be crueler. I thought compassion was weakness, that kindness was a chain around the neck of ambition. I pushed people away, I crushed those who stood in my path, and I wore my success like armor. But inside," his voice broke, and for a moment the only sound was the steady beep of the monitor. "Inside I was empty. The maid's eyes softened. She remembered the coldness that filled the mansion, how silence echoed through its great halls. She remembered serving meals where no one spoke, cleaning rooms where tension clung to the air. She remembered the loneliness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. One night, he said slowly, I nearly threw it all away. I had lost a deal, an important one. My rage was so strong that I broke everything I touched. My family was afraid of me. My employees walked on eggshells. And I was ready to destroy myself. That was the night you walked into my study. Her fingers tightened slightly around his hand. She remembered it too. He had been pacing like a storm trapped in a man's body, his face red with fury, his voice shaking the walls. No one dared enter. No one but her. She had carried in a cup of tea, placed it quietly on his desk, and spoken only one sentence. Sir, if you lose yourself, you lose everything else. He looked at her now, his eyes wet with the memory. You do not know what that did to me. In that moment I realized you saw me not as a monster, not as a master, but as a man. And for the first time I felt the weight of who I was becoming. You gave me back something I thought I had lost. Myself. The family outside grew restless, straining to catch fragments of the words drifting through the door. They had never heard their father speak like this. To them, he had always been the pillar of strength, unyielding and cold. But here he was, confessing that a single sentence from a maid had changed the course of his life. I built towers after that night, he said, his voice growing weaker. I built companies, I built wealth, I built power. But none of it would have existed if you had not stopped me from destroying myself. They will never understand this, but you saved me, not with money, not with force, but with words, with kindness. Tears formed in the maid's eyes, but she held them back, her dignity steady. She had never told anyone about that night, never considered it more than a small act of compassion. To her, it had simply been the right thing to do. She had not done it for reward, nor recognition, nor memory. Yet here she was, decades later, hearing that her simple act had been the turning point for a man who shaped industries. You see, he whispered, my empire rests on a foundation no one knows about. Not steel, not stone, but a moment of humanity given to me by you. The silence in the room grew heavy. The nurse at the corner lowered her eyes, moved by the confession. The family outside grew quieter, their whispers fading as the truth sank in. They had chased their father's shadow for years, trying to match his ruthlessness, his hunger, his will to dominate. Yet here he was, telling them that his true turning point had come from kindness, from humility, from someone they had overlooked all their lives. The maid finally spoke, her voice low but strong. Sir, I never thought I did anything grand. I only reminded you of what you already knew deep inside, that no empire, no matter how tall, stands without a soul to guide it. You chose to listen, and that is why you built what you built. He smiled faintly, though his lips trembled. Perhaps, but I want the world to know the truth. My children must hear it, even if they hate it. They must understand that wealth without compassion is a curse, and I cannot leave this world until I speak it aloud. His voice broke into silence, and the monitor beeped steadily, each sound a reminder that time was running thin. The maid sat quietly, her hand still resting in his, her presence as steady as it had been years ago when she first stood before him in his darkest night. And in that hospital room, the hidden story of a billionaire was revealed, not a story of cold steel and endless wealth, but a story of a fragile man saved by the simplest act of kindness. It was a story his family had never known, a truth they had never imagined, and one that would change everything they thought they understood about him and themselves. The door opened slowly, and one by one the billionaire's children entered the room. Their steps were stiff, their faces tight, their eyes filled with questions they did not want to ask aloud. They had been listening from the hallway, catching fragments of their father's voice, hearing words that sounded strange coming from him. This was a man who had never spoken of weakness, never admitted dependence, never allowed anyone to believe he owed something to another. Yet tonight they had heard him speak about a maid, about kindness, about how she had saved him from himself. The eldest son stood closest to the bed, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw clenched so hard it looked as though his teeth might crack. Father, he said firmly, you cannot mean what you are saying. You built everything with your own hands, your own mind. No servant shaped you. You shaped yourself. The billionaire turned his head slowly toward his son. His eyes were tired but sharp. The kind of gaze that could still silence a boardroom even now when his body was failing. "You are wrong," he said softly. "I was on the edge of losing myself." She stopped me. Without her, there would be no empire, no wealth, no legacy. All of it rests on a single moment when she chose to remind me of my humanity. The son's face hardened. He had spent his whole life trying to live up to the shadow of his father, believing ruthlessness was the only way to succeed. To hear now that it had been kindness, a servant's words that shaped his father's path, shook him to his core. He did not want to accept it. One of the daughters spoke next, her voice sharp, laced with disbelief. "Father, this is not the time for fables. We are here, your blood, your family. Why should a maid take up these last hours instead of us?" The old man's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "Because you do not understand. You see wealth and power as the crown of life." She saw the man beneath the crown, and that is what matters in the end. The maid sat quietly at his side, her hand still holding his. She did not speak, did not defend herself. Her presence alone was enough. The family, however, could not contain themselves. The younger son stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Do you know how this looks? The world will laugh if they hear you wasted your last words on a maid. Our name will be mocked. People will say we were built on pity." The billionaire coughed, his chest heaving, but he forced the words out. "Let them laugh. I am not ashamed. The truth is not pity. The truth is power. The truth is that kindness is greater than cruelty. And it is a lesson you must learn, or all that I built will crumble when I am gone." The room went still. The nurse, standing quietly in the corner, lowered her eyes. Even she felt the weight of his words. The lawyer, who had been waiting silently in the background, finally stepped forward with a folder in his hands. "Perhaps now is the time," he said carefully, "to share your instructions. They must be spoken clearly while there is still strength in you." The billionaire nodded faintly, his breathing shallow but steady. "Yes, it is time." The family leaned in, their eyes hungry, their ears sharp. They expected talk of shares, of companies, of estates, of numbers written in ink that would decide the rest of their lives. But what came next struck them like a storm. "I have divided my fortune," the old man said, his voice low but certain. "You will each receive what is fair. But know this, I have also set aside a portion. Not for business, not for glory, not even for you. It is for her." The words hit like thunder. Gasps filled the room. The eldest son's eyes went wide. His daughter's mouth fell open, the younger son stepped back in shock. "For her?" he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. The billionaire's hand trembled, but his grip on the maid's fingers did not loosen. "Yes, for her. Because without her, there would be nothing to give you. What she gave me is worth more than money, but I will honor it with what money can give." The family erupted. Some voices rose in protest, others pleaded. "Father, you cannot do this," cried the eldest son. "She was a servant. She was paid for her work. That was her role. Why give her more?" The old man's eyes flashed with a sudden strength that silenced them. "She was more than her role. She was the one who showed me what none of you understand. That greatness is hollow without goodness. You are blind because I raised you in shadows of pride. But now before I leave you will see the light even if it blinds you." The maid shook her head quietly, her voice breaking the storm for the first time. "Sir, I never wanted anything. I do not need your fortune. I lived my life with what I had, and it was enough. I came only because you asked." His eyes turned to her, soft and grateful. "I know, that is why you deserve it. You did not ask, yet you gave. You did not demand, yet you changed me. This is not charity. It is justice." The family fell into stunned silence. Some still bristled with anger, their pride wounded, their greed unsettled. But beneath their protest, doubt began to creep in. They had always thought their father's success came from strength, from discipline, from hard edges. Now he was telling them that the foundation was something else entirely. For the first time in their lives, they felt the ground under their feet shift. Their inheritance no longer felt like entitlement. It felt like a question, a test. The billionaire closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with effort. "I have given you wealth, but if you cannot learn the lesson she gave me, then wealth will destroy you. Remember this, money without compassion is poison." The maid sat quietly, tears welling in her eyes. She had never expected to be the center of such a moment. Never imagined the weight of her words from years ago would ripple this far. She did not want his fortune, yet she understood why he insisted. It was not about money. It was about truth. In that hospital room, surrounded by silence heavier than stone, The family faced a truth they could not escape. Their father, the man they had idolized and feared, had lifted a maid above wealth, above power, above pride. And in doing so, he revealed the weakness in their hearts and the emptiness of their lives. Shock filled them, not just at what he had given, but at what he had taken away. The illusion that greatness came only from strength. And as they stood there, unable to speak, the maid remained by his side, steady as ever. She was no longer the servant in their father's story. She was the reason that story had ever been written at all. The billionaire's breathing grew slower, each inhale seeming to demand more strength than the one before. The room was heavy with silence, yet it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of people grappling with truths they had never wanted to hear. His children, polished and proud, stood in disbelief, some clutching their arms tightly, others staring blankly at the floor. They had lived their entire lives under the shadow of his empire, believing his power was the measure of greatness. But now, in his final hours, he was tearing down the image they had built of him and replacing it with something altogether different. The maid sat at his side, her presence calm, her hand steady in his. She did not look at the family, nor at the lawyer, nor at the nurse standing in the corner. Her focus was on the frail man before her, the same man she had once seen at his most volatile, his most human. She had known then what no one else had seen, and now the world was finally hearing it. The billionaire opened his eyes again, his voice rough but carrying an edge of clarity that made everyone lean closer. "Listen to me," he whispered. "I have given you wealth, but wealth is not enough. It will never be enough. You can fill houses with gold and still feel emptier than a beggar. You can own cities and still be lonelier than a man with nothing. I know because I lived that way." His eldest son shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing. His father's words had a sharpness that cut deeper than any reprimand he had received as a boy. The old man continued, each sentence spoken slowly, as though carved out of what little strength he had left. "I thought power made me strong. I thought money made me safe. I thought respect was something you could buy with fear. But none of it gave me peace. None of it filled the hollow place inside me. Do you know what did? A servant's kindness. A moment of humanity when I was drowning in my own anger." The maid lowered her gaze, but her eyes glistened. She had never imagined that one quiet act of compassion would ripple through the years like this. She had spoken words in the dark, thinking they would be forgotten. But they had become the light he carried all his life. The billionaire's children shifted again, their pride battling with the cracks forming inside them. For years they had followed his example as they understood it. Hardness, ambition, cold precision. They had treated people as stepping stones, believing that was the way to honor their father's legacy. But here he was, telling them that they had misunderstood everything. "You think I called her here to shame you," he said, his eyes glancing toward them. "But I did not. I called her here because you must see what I failed to show you. You must see what truly matters before it is too late. If you inherit my fortune without learning this lesson, then you inherit not wealth but ruin." His daughter, the one who had earlier protested, finally spoke, her voice trembling though she tried to steady it. "What are you saying, Father? That all we have done, all we have worked for means nothing?" He shook his head weakly. "Not nothing, but it means little if it stands alone. Success without compassion is failure wearing a mask. Ambition without mercy is destruction in disguise. And wealth without kindness is poison. You cannot build a life worth living on poison." The words struck them like a blow. Their father had never spoken like this. His teachings had always been about winning, about strength, about control. Now as his body faded, he was undoing years of lessons in a matter of minutes. The maid finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Sir, you have already given them more than they know. Perhaps they will understand in time." He turned to her, his eyes heavy with gratitude. "You gave me the chance to understand. If they choose not to, that is their choice. But I could not leave this world without showing them." The lawyer stepped closer, his papers still in hand, but even he seemed moved by what was happening. "Sir, your instructions are clear. But do you wish me to explain them to your children now or after?" The billionaire raised a trembling hand. "Now let them hear it from me." The lawyer cleared his throat, opening the folder. "As instructed, a significant portion of your estate will go to charitable foundations. The rest will be divided among your family. However, a special trust has been created in the maid's name. It will not go to her alone. but to projects she chooses, community centers, scholarships, opportunities for those who have none. The family erupted again, their voices clashing, some angry, some desperate, but the old man silenced them with one sharp word. Enough. His voice, though frail, carried the authority of a lifetime. They froze. This is not a loss for you, he said. It is a gain for the world. And if you are wise, it will be a gain for you too. For what is the point of riches if all they buy you is isolation? What is the point of wealth if it cannot lift others? Learn this, or your inheritance will rot in your hands. The room grew still again. The maid's hand trembled now in his, but she did not let go. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present, changing the air itself. Promise me, he whispered, looking at his children. Promise me you will not repeat my mistakes. Do not wait until the end to realize what matters. Do not build walls so high that you cannot see the people who gave you the ground to build on. His voice faltered, his chest rising and falling with effort. The nurse adjusted his pillow, but he waved her away. His eyes stayed fixed on his children and then on the maid. This is my final lesson. Wealth fades. Names fade. But the good you do, that is what lasts. Tears filled the eyes of one of the younger children, the one who had spoken the least. For the first time she stepped closer, her voice small. I promise, Father, she whispered. The billionaire smiled faintly, his lips trembling. One promise is enough to keep me at peace. The maid looked at the family, at the way they stood divided yet shaken, and she knew that seeds had been planted. Whether they would grow or wither was not hers to decide, but at least the truth had been spoken. In that hospital room, with the hum of machines and the fading strength of a dying man, a lesson greater than any empire was given. It was not written in contracts or carved in stone towers. It was written in hearts, and if those hearts chose to carry it, it would outlast the fortune itself. The billionaire closed his eyes at last, his breathing slow, his hand still in the maid's. For a moment, it seemed as if the world paused, waiting. The family stood silent, their anger muted, their thoughts unspoken. And in that silence, the lesson lingered, heavy and unshakable. It was the lesson of a lifetime, and it would echo long after the machines in that room fell quiet. The morning sun crept through the hospital blinds, casting pale golden lines across the white floor. The machines had gone quiet, their steady beeps replaced with a stillness that carried the weight of finality. The billionaire had passed in the early hours, his hand still resting in the maid's as if even in death he wanted to hold on to the one connection that had reminded him of his humanity. For a long while no one moved. His children stood in silence, their expressions unreadable, torn between grief, confusion, and the heavy words that still echoed in their minds. The maid sat beside him longer than anyone else. She had seen many things in her life, struggle, loss, injustice, but this moment felt different. She had not come expecting wealth, recognition, or even gratitude. She had come because he asked. And in his final hours she had witnessed not the billionaire the world admired, but the man who had finally spoken the truth about himself. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, her heart heavy but steady. She whispered a prayer under her breath and left the room quietly, carrying with her the memory of a man both broken and redeemed. Outside, the lawyer gathered the family in the waiting lounge. His voice was professional, but even he could not hide the weight of what he was about to say. Your father's will is clear, he began. The division of assets is already set. Each of you will receive what was written, but understand the largest portion is tied to a trust that will not serve only this family. It will serve communities, fund education, and provide opportunities for those who have none. And that trust will be guided by the maid he asked to see in his final hours. The words fell like stones into water, rippling through the air. The eldest son's face darkened, his fist clenched, but he said nothing. The younger daughter covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glistening. The other sat in stunned silence. For the first time, their inheritance was not just about them. It was about something larger, something they had never considered. The maid was called into the room again, and the lawyer turned to her with respect in his eyes. Madam, your role in this trust is not for personal gain. Your responsibility is to direct these funds toward causes you believe in. Schools, hospitals, community centers, places that lift people from the shadows. She shook her head gently, overwhelmed. I never asked for this. I do not need it, the lawyer's tone softened. Perhaps not. But he wanted you to understand that your kindness was not forgotten. He wanted your compassion to continue through his wealth. where his own hands could no longer reach. Her eyes filled with quiet tears, but she nodded. If that is his wish, then I will honor it. Not for myself, but for those who need it more than I ever did. The family looked at her with a mixture of resentment and awe. In their eyes, she had been a shadow in their childhood, a figure they barely noticed. Yet now she stood at the center of their father's legacy, not because she demanded it, but because she had once spoken truth when no one else dared. Weeks passed, and news of the billionaire's unusual will spread beyond the family. Newspapers carried the story. Billionaire leaves fortune in hands of former maid. Some headlines mocked it, others praised it, but everywhere it stirred conversation. People wondered why a man of such stature would entrust his wealth not to tycoons or politicians, but to a woman who had once scrubbed his floors. And when the truth of her influence came out, the story of her, quiet words that saved him from his own destruction, it touched hearts far beyond the reach of his empire. The maid did not move into mansions or surround herself with luxury. She stayed in her modest home, wearing the same simple clothes, walking the same streets. But now she carried a responsibility that stretched far beyond her own life. She began visiting schools, speaking to children about kindness not as a lecture but as a story. She spoke to young workers about dignity, reminding them that no role was small when done with integrity. She directed funds towards scholarships, ensuring that children who could not afford education would have the chance to rise. She visited communities often overlooked, where her presence was not as a benefactor above them, but as one of them. The billionaire's children, though divided at first, began to see the truth in his final words. The eldest son resisted the longest, clinging to pride and the belief that wealth was only meant to preserve power. But even he could not deny the impact of the projects funded by the trust. He saw young people finding opportunity where once there was none, families lifted out of poverty, lives changed in ways money alone could not measure. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to take part, not as a master but as a participant. His siblings followed, some with humility, others with hesitation, but all with growing awareness that their father's lesson was real. The maid never raised her voice, never boasted about the role she had been given. She remained humble, guiding quietly, always remembering that it was not her name she carried but the responsibility of a man who had chosen to confess the truth before it was too late. She honored him not by celebrating his wealth, but by using it as a tool to do what he had wished for but never fully achieved, lifting others. Years later, when people spoke of the billionaire, they no longer spoke only of his towers, his companies, or his ruthless deals. They spoke of his final hours, of the maid who held his hand, and of the legacy rewritten not in steel and glass, but in lives touched and futures rebuilt. His story became less about the empire he built and more about the humanity he rediscovered at the end. And the maid, who had once been invisible, became the keeper of that story, not by choice, but by destiny. She carried it with quiet dignity until her own final days, knowing that the words she had spoken in a moment of compassion had outlived both her and the man she once served. The legacy of the billionaire was no longer measured in wealth, it was measured in kindness, and in the end that was what changed everything.